Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
Thanksgiving in our family has always been a theater of passive-aggressive traditions, where smiles are painted on and silence fills the gaps where honesty should live. It's a stage where everyone plays the part they were assigned decades ago, and God forbid someone forgets their lines. For me, that role has always been the observer, the extra at the edge of the family photo, smiling just enough, speaking just enough, but never too loud, never too proud. And on that particular Thanksgiving, when I walked through the front door of my parents' over-decorated, cinnamon-scented home, I already knew that no matter how much I'd achieved this year, no one would ask. No one ever does. The moment I stepped in, I was met with the sound of my mother's overexcited voice echoing from the kitchen. "Brian and Lindsay are bringing the pies. Homemade pumpkin with whipped cream. Isn't that just the sweetest?" As I set the bottle of Cabernet I brought on the counter, she looked up from her carefully basted turkey like I was the UPS guy, not her daughter. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, immediately shifting her focus to whether the yams were caramelizing enough. Not a single question about the trip, my business, or how I was doing. Just a distracted, "You look thin." That's mom speak for "you look tired or older," or maybe I just have nothing better to say. I sat at the edge of the kitchen island, watching as she fluttered from oven to counter, not once stopping to look at me. I've built a 7-property real estate portfolio in the last 3 years, closed on a commercial space in downtown Charlotte 2 weeks ago, and hired 2 new employees just last month. But all that must pale in comparison to Brian successfully getting his kids into soccer and buying a house with his wife's Pinterest board aesthetic. I could have cured cancer, and she would have still asked if I planned on settling down anytime soon, like it was the only checkbox that mattered. Brian and Lindsay showed up 15 minutes later, late as always, but greeted like royalty. The kids ran inside with sticky hands and oversized coats, immediately jumping onto the couch while Lindsay launched into a play-by-play of their last few weeks, the dance recital, the car troubles, the new coffee place that's so much better than Starbucks. Brian carried in a stack of Tupperware and shouted, "Smells amazing in here, Mom," to which she giggled and waved her hands like she was about to curtsy. It was the same every year. I'd bring wine worth more than their entire dinner budget, and they'd bring Cool Whip and be praised like saints. Dinner was served at exactly 5:30, because my mother is nothing if not controlling with time, and we all shuffled around the table while she recited her usual blessings and instructions: light meat or dark? No, George, the rolls go counterclockwise. I sat between Dad and one of Brian's sugar high kids, who kept dropping mashed potatoes on the carpet, which my mother conveniently ignored. Across from me sat Lindsay with her perfect hair, and next to her, Brian in a collared shirt he probably bought just for the occasion. Everything was moving along the usual script until the moment we got to dessert. That's when it happened, the toast. The moment that cracked the artificial piece wide open. My mother lifted her wine glass, cheap Chardonnay from a bottle shaped like a penguin, and cleared her throat in the dramatic way she always does when she wants everyone's attention. Before we dig into Lindsay's amazing pie, she began, "I just want to say how proud we are, George and I both, of Brian and his new home. It's such a milestone, and he's worked so hard. Truly, it's a blessing for the whole family." Everyone clinked glasses and smiled. My father nodded with that tired, polite smile he always wears. Brian leaned back in his chair like a king in a throne room. Lindsay beamed, and the kids barely looked up from their whipped cream volcanoes. I took a sip of my wine, slow and quiet, not because I needed the alcohol, but because I needed the pause, the breath, the few seconds to choose whether I'd stay silent like I always had or say something, anything, that would remind them I was there. Not just physically, but wholly. And that's when I said it. Not loudly. Not with sarcasm. Just a calm, level voice. "I'm happy for him. My real estate portfolio's doing fine too." The room went still. I watched as my mother's smile faded like someone had pulled the plug on a dimming lamp. She blinked once and then gave me that thin-lipped expression she saves for strangers at the grocery store. Brian shifted in his seat, but said nothing. Lindsay reached for her glass with a small, nervous laugh, trying to smooth over the sudden chill that had entered the room. My dad just looked down at his plate. No one clinked glasses for me. No one asked how many units I own now. No one said, "Wow, that's incredible," or even, "That's great, honey." They just sat there, stunned, as if I had farted at the table or announced a criminal record. That was the moment I knew they didn't forget me. They chose to ignore me. And that made all the difference. Because if they had simply forgotten, if it had been an innocent lapse of memory or a poorly timed toast, I might have let it go. I might have swallowed my pride like I had every other year and gone back to my hotel room with a container of leftovers and a forced sense of peace. But that moment revealed something deeper, something uglier. I wasn't invisible by accident. I was invisible by design. I had been scripted out of this family's narrative, cut from the final edit to make room for the polished life they preferred to show off. My success wasn't inconvenient, it was threatening. It didn't fit into the frame of the picture they wanted to hang over their fireplace. I smiled, leaned back in my chair, and watched the pie slices go around the table. Nobody met my eye. They didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. And I wasn't just here to eat this year. I was here to remind them that even the daughter who never got a spotlight can cast a hell of a long shadow when she decides she's done playing quiet. And trust me, this was just the first course. It's a strange kind of pain, the one you don't even notice at first, because it's not sharp, not immediate, not screaming for your attention. It's more like a dull ache that settles somewhere between your ribs and your pride, creeping in so slowly over the years that by the time you finally feel it, it's already woven itself into the fabric of who you are. That's the kind of pain I felt sitting at that dinner table, watching my mother recoil, barely, but noticeably, from the sound of my success. And what made it worse wasn't her silence. It was the look, that brief, flickering twitch in her expression that didn't say, "I didn't know," or even, "I'm surprised," but instead whispered, "I wish you hadn't said that." As the rest of the evening stumbled along, patched together with forced laughter and too sweet pie, I found myself drifting inward, floating back through a long catalog of moments that I now realized weren't isolated or accidental, but carefully curated omissions. The list of things they forgot, my list, was long and familiar, a mental scrapbook filled not with pictures, but with absences, like a wedding album where the bride is always just out of frame. I remembered the day I got my first promotion, working at that boutique property firm with barely any staff and twice the work. I was 27, living in a half-renovated duplex I could barely afford, but when I got that title, Assistant Development Coordinator, I called home thinking, foolishly, that someone might say they were proud. My mother's response? Well, just don't let it get in the way of starting a family. My father mumbled something about making sure I was saving for retirement. And Brian? He said, "Wait, what is it you do?" Again? The thing is, when people repeatedly fail to acknowledge your milestones, you start to wonder if maybe you imagine them. You look at your own life like it's written in invisible ink, valid only when seen under the right light, and my family never turned that light on. They clapped when Brian made JV football, toasted him when he got into that second-rate state college with average grades, and practically threw a parade when he married Lindsay, a woman so aggressively sweet it felt like she was grown in a lab to charm parents. Meanwhile, when I bought my first house, by myself, with no cosigner, after spending 3 years saving every cent that didn't go to rent or ramen, my mother sent a card. No call. No visit. Just a card with a sunflower on the front and the words, "Wishing you joy," written in shaky cursive. And maybe, for a while, I told myself that was just her way, that not everyone knows how to show pride or affection the same way. I excused the omissions, minimized the slights, convinced myself that being ignored was better than being resented. But the older I got, and the more I built, not just properties, but a life that was full of independence and grit, the harder it became to keep pretending that I was imagining it all. Especially when I overheard things. Things not meant for me. Like that afternoon, maybe 5 years ago, when I came by unannounced and heard my mother on the phone in the kitchen, talking to her sister. She didn't hear me walk in. I stood there, frozen behind the doorframe, listening as she said, "Rachel's always been a bit cold. Too practical. No softness. But Brian? He's got heart." I didn't interrupt. I didn't slam the door or storm out. I just stood there, like a ghost in my own childhood home, and listened until she changed the subject. That sentence has echoed in my mind more times than I care to admit, not because it hurt, though it did, but because it confirmed everything I'd quietly suspected my entire adult life. So when she said what she said at the table, after the toast, when things got quiet and I tried to salvage some kind of civility with a smile, her words landed with the subtle cruelty of a needle prick right to the vein. "Money doesn't mean much if you're all alone," she said, eyes on her pie, not on me. Not cruel in tone, just soft, casual, like an observation about the weather. And somehow that made it worse. The message was clear. My success was hollow because it didn't come packaged in the form they valued: husband, children, church on Sundays, matching pajamas on Christmas. Never mind the fact that Brian had been bailed out of debt twice. Never mind that he still called our dad for help fixing his furnace, or that he'd never, not once, made it through a dinner without Lindsay correcting his math. He had the right accessories, so he won. I stared at her for a long second, not blinking, not moving, just letting the heat rise behind my eyes while I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. And then I said it, not angrily, not even loudly. Just a single, calm sentence. "Well, it bought me the house Brian tried to bid on last month." The room froze, a silence so sharp it felt like glass. My mother's fork paused midair. Brian blinked. Lindsay looked like she'd just been slapped, though whether by surprise or recognition, I couldn't tell. And my father, bless him, finally looked up from his plate and whispered, "What?" I leaned back, took a long sip of wine, and looked my brother dead in the eye. "That 4-bedroom in South End, near the park? The one with the wraparound porch and solar panels? You offered $680. I went in at $750, no contingencies." The color drained from Lindsay's face. She glanced at Brian, who didn't say a word, his jaw tightening as he pushed his plate away. My mother, still holding her fork, slowly set it down like it was suddenly made of lead. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let the truth settle like a fog over the table, thick and inescapable. Because I wasn't trying to brag. I wasn't even trying to hurt them. I was trying to be seen. To be acknowledged not for who I used to be, the quiet girl, the planner, the one who never needed anything, but for who I had become. A woman who didn't wait for her name to be called, who didn't need their applause, but who damn well deserved their respect. And as the tension hung in the room like smoke after a fire, I realized that this was no longer about Thanksgiving. It was about history. And mine, for once, was going to be heard. Because the list of things they forgot was long, but the list of things I remembered, that one was longer. And now, it was finally my turn to speak. There's something unsettling about realizing that the people who claim to love you, those who helped raise you, fed you, and framed your school photos, might not only misunderstand who you are, but quietly resent what you've become. It's like stepping into your childhood bedroom and finding everything perfectly preserved, posters still taped to the walls, trophies still gathering dust, only to open the closet and discover it's filled with someone else's clothes. The discomfort isn't in the unfamiliarity. It's in the unsettling truth that you were replaced long before you even left. That's exactly how I felt, sitting at that dinner table, while the memory of that house, the house, swelled like a tide inside me, threatening to rise past my composure and drown the quiet, civil version of myself I had worked so hard to maintain. What no one at the table had known until that moment was that the home my brother had tried to buy, the house he had bragged about during our last family group text, the one he called perfect for our forever chapter, had already been on my radar long before he even walked through its door with his real estate agent. I had been watching that neighborhood for months, keeping tabs on listings and crunching numbers, waiting for the right property to hit the market. I hadn't known he was interested in it, not at first. In fact, it wasn't until my agent forwarded the list of competing offers that I saw his name, Brian Jacob Taylor, third from the top, offering well below what I was willing to spend, riding in on the hope that charm and family ties would somehow outweigh cold, hard numbers. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not out of spite or malice, but out of a deeply rooted instinct I had spent my entire adult life nurturing, the drive to survive, to build, to claim space in a world where no one was saving a seat for me at the table. When you're used to being overlooked, you learn not to ask for permission. You learn to take the opportunities others assume belong to someone else. And in that moment, reading his name on that offer list, something ancient and unspoken clicked into place, a quiet voice that said, "You've spent your whole life moving aside for him. Not this time." So I made the call. I didn't ask for approval. I didn't worry about stepping on toes. I simply offered $75,000 over asking, waived every contingency, and closed in just under 2 weeks. It wasn't just a strategic investment. It was a statement, one he wouldn't understand until it was too late. Now, watching his face twitch with the realization that I hadn't just outbid him, but had deliberately chosen to close on that property, the weight of years began to settle over the table like a storm cloud. Lindsay finally spoke, her voice thin and brittle, trying to keep her composure, but clearly unraveling at the edges. "You knew that was the house we wanted, Rachel. That wasn't just a listing to us. That was our future." I didn't look at her right away. I turned my gaze toward my mother, who stared at her plate as if it had betrayed her, and then finally met Lindsay's eyes. "I didn't know until I saw the name," I said, calm but direct. "And once I did, I knew I wanted it more. And, unlike you two, I didn't need anyone's help to get it." The silence that followed was one of those thick, breathless moments where everyone knows something irreversible has occurred, but no one wants to be the first to admit it. My mother opened her mouth slightly, as if to object, to scold, or maybe even to reason with me, but then she closed it again and folded her napkin with trembling hands. My father, ever the diplomat, reached for the water pitcher as though hydration could diffuse generational resentment. But Brian? Brian finally cracked. He pushed back from the table with a sharp motion, muttering something under his breath, and for the first time in a long time, I saw it, that simmering, seething frustration that had always been there beneath his jokes and toothy smiles. He stood up, walked into the kitchen, and for a moment, I wondered if he would actually come back. I almost hoped he wouldn't. But he did, holding the wine bottle I had brought, the good Cabernet he wouldn't have recognized even if he drank the whole damn thing. He poured himself a generous glass and stared at me over the rim. "So what now?" he asked, his tone bitter and clipped. "You going to rent it out to some tech couple from New York and turn the yard into an Airbnb Zen garden?" I didn't blink. "No," I said slowly, letting every syllable sink. "I rented it to a couple from Raleigh. No kids. Work-from-home types. Very clean. Oh, and they're married. To each other. Both of them are women." The reaction was immediate. My mother dropped her fork. Lindsay blinked 3 times in succession. My father, poor man, took a large gulp of wine and closed his eyes, as if a headache had finally arrived after decades of bracing for it. It wasn't just the fact that I had bought the house. It was that I had filled it with people who represented everything my mother tried so hard to pretend didn't exist. And I didn't do it out of malice, not really. I did it because I could. Because for once, I held the power. For once, I was the one making decisions that rippled into their world, instead of the other way around. And the most satisfying part of it all was that I hadn't broken a single rule. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't begged. I hadn't even lied. I had simply done what they'd never expected. I had beaten them at their own game. But even as I watched them squirm in their carefully upholstered dining chairs, part of me felt the ache of a deeper truth, a sadness that this was what it had come to. That in order to be noticed, to be respected, I had to crush something they loved. That my achievements only became real to them when they caused discomfort. And maybe that's what anger really is at its core, not rage or fire, but the exhaustion of having to prove, again and again, that you deserve to take up space. So I finished my wine. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or demand recognition. I just sat there, letting the weight of my choices settle around them like the scent of something permanent, paint drying on walls they'd never live in, laughter echoing from rooms they'd never step into. And though no one said it out loud, I could feel the shift. I wasn't the extra anymore. I wasn't the forgotten one. I was the storm that had rolled in through their perfect family dinner, uninvited, undeniable, and entirely in control. And the most ironic part? I hadn't even started yet. It's remarkable, in a bitterly ironic way, how easily people forget that silence is not absence, and that just because someone has learned to live without recognition doesn't mean they've stopped watching, listening, remembering. For years, I had played the part of the dutiful outsider, the one who showed up to holiday dinners on time, brought thoughtful gifts no one acknowledged, politely navigated awkward questions about my relationship status, and accepted the casual, often unconscious dismissals that seemed to slip from my mother's mouth like breath, effortless, natural, and always just sharp enough to cut. I endured it not because I lacked a spine, but because I mistakenly believed that eventually, inevitably, they would see the bigger picture, that time would balance the scales, and that fairness, even if delayed, would one day arrive wrapped in sincerity. But fairness, I would come to learn, has no foothold in families like mine, where love is not given freely but rationed out. Like wartime sugar, doled in teaspoons to those who play by the rules, and denied to anyone who dares question who gets to write them. It was after that Thanksgiving dinner, after the awkward clearing of dishes and the silent retreat of Brian to the guest bathroom, that my father finally did something he hadn't done in decades. He pulled me aside. Not with ceremony or force, but with that quiet, almost invisible desperation of a man who's spent too long watching a ship sink and convincing himself the water wasn't rising. He waited until my mother had disappeared into the kitchen, her voice trailing behind her as she fussed about Tupperware and foil, and then motioned with his head for me to follow him down the hallway. We ended up in his study, a small, wood-paneled room that had always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper, though I'd never once seen him smoke. He closed the door behind us and sat down heavily in the worn leather chair by the desk, the same chair where he used to read to me when I was small enough to think bedtime stories could keep nightmares away. He didn't look at me for a moment, just stared at his hands, thick and weathered, knuckles scarred from years of blue-collar labor before the promotions came and the button-down shirts replaced the steel-toed boots. "I suppose you buying that house wasn't a coincidence," he said, and though the sentence was framed as a question, the tone told me he already knew the answer. I didn't reply, because there was nothing to explain. The facts spoke for themselves. He nodded once, a slow, resigned motion, and then reached into the desk drawer, pulling out a slim, manila folder. He didn't hand it to me right away, just held it in his lap, his thumb brushing the corner, his eyes unfocused. "Your mother made changes to the estate plans," he said finally, the words falling like stones. "A couple years back. Said it was more practical that way." His voice was low, hoarse with guilt or age or maybe both. "She didn't want to talk about it much. Just handed me a new draft and said it made more sense." I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not anger, not even surprise, but the cold confirmation of something I had long suspected but never dared speak aloud. "Let me guess," I said, keeping my voice even. "The house goes to Brian. The savings too, probably. And I get the brokerage accounts. Maybe a few bonds." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Instead, he finally handed me the folder, and inside was the updated will, clean, clinical language that spelled out exactly what I already knew. Brian would inherit the family home, the majority of the liquid assets, and anything deemed of sentimental value. I, on the other hand, would receive the remaining investments, efficient, profitable, impersonal. It was the kind of distribution you'd make if you thought of one child as a legacy and the other as a ledger. What he didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I already had a copy. I had known for over a year. After a particularly cold birthday lunch, during which my mother had managed to express concern that I was working too hard and missing my window, within the same breath, I'd started digging. Not because I suspected anything specific, but because I had learned long ago that the things they don't say often matter more than the things they do. It hadn't taken much. One connection at the county clerk's office, a discreet request, and the documents had been in my inbox before the week was over. And seeing the hierarchy etched into legal language, hadn't shocked me. It had simply clarified what I already knew in my bones. But I had waited. I hadn't stormed in with accusations or thrown it in anyone's face. I had filed it away like a weapon waiting for a war. And now, here in this quiet study, my father looking at me like a man hoping for forgiveness he hadn't earned. I realized this wasn't the moment to rage. It was the moment to let him know, not with fire, but with frost, that I was not the daughter they had dismissed. I was the daughter they had underestimated. "I'm not taking anything from you," I said, watching him carefully. "Not the stocks, not the house, not the guilt. I already took what mattered." He frowned slightly, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, standing slowly, "that house, the one you were going to pass on like a family heirloom? I own it now. And the money you saved for Brian's future? You've already spent it. College, car loans, mortgage co-signing. I built my life with nothing. Every inch of it is mine. So no, I don't want your inheritance. I already have everything I need and everything he wanted." He didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands still resting on that folder, his face a study in conflict, part shame, part sadness, part something that might have been respect, if only it had arrived a decade earlier. I didn't wait for him to find the words. I walked out of the study, past the framed photos on the hallway wall, Brian's graduation, Brian's wedding, Brian with the grandkids at the beach, and I felt nothing. No jealousy, no anger, just a quiet certainty that I had finally stepped out of the picture entirely. As I re-entered the dining room, my mother glanced up briefly, her eyes narrowing when she saw the look on my face. Not triumphant. Not smug. Just finished. Lindsay was stacking dishes in the kitchen, and Brian was nowhere to be seen. The kids were playing in the den, unaware that the tectonic plates of their family's legacy had just shifted. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer hugs or promises to call. I simply picked up my coat from the back of the chair, walked to the front door, and stepped out into the night. And as I stood there, breathing in the cold November air, I knew without a doubt that the story they had been writing, the story where I was the footnote, the extra, the unfulfilled daughter, had ended. I had started my own chapter. And the ink was permanent. There's a particular stillness that follows the moment a long-standing lie has finally unraveled, not with the drama of shouting or slammed doors, but with the slow, irreversible collapse of a structure that had been quietly crumbling for years, held together only by denial, favoritism, and the brittle glue of family tradition. As I stood in the doorway of my parents' house, the night air curling around me like an exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding, I understood that there was no triumph in what I had done, not in the way people expect, anyway. Because winning a war no one admits is happening leaves behind a strange kind of silence, one where no one claps, no one cheers, and no one dares speak the truth aloud, even when it's burning like a match between their teeth. I had not set out to ruin Thanksgiving, not in the performative sense that people like my mother would later frame it, accusations whispered over phone calls and retold at bridge tables, watered down and reshaped to make me the villain who just couldn't let things be. What I had done was far simpler and, to her mind, far less forgivable. I had interrupted the narrative. I had rewritten the roles. I had taken everything they assumed I would never reach for, not because I wasn't capable, but because I was always too polite, too distant, too independent to demand it. And that night, as I walked to my car with the sound of brittle voices behind me and the faint clatter of dishes being washed by someone who didn't know how to look me in the eye, I felt something more profound than satisfaction. I felt clean. But I wasn't done. Before I left the house, before the door clicked shut behind me, I had left a final gesture, an ending, or maybe a beginning, depending on how they chose to see it. It wasn't angry, it wasn't cruel, but it was honest in a way they were never willing to be. As I passed by the table, still cluttered with crumbs and cold coffee, I placed 3 small envelopes, each one identical in size and weight, neatly arranged next to the plates of the 3 people who had shaped the most painful parts of my life, not with overt cruelty, but with the subtle erasures that only family knows how to inflict. Each envelope contained a few pages, no letters, no explanations, just facts. The first was the listing record for the house Brian had tried to buy, showing my name as the owner of record, the offer date, and the final closing amount. The second was a photo of me and my team at the signing, grinning not for the sake of petty revenge, but because it marked the culmination of years of planning, of sleepless nights and exhausting negotiations that no one in that house had ever once asked about. The third was a short, handwritten note in my neat, deliberate handwriting. I didn't need your pride. Just your silence. Thanks for that. There was no venom in the words, only clarity, the kind of quiet finality that can only come from someone who has stopped asking to be seen. I didn't wait to see their reactions. I didn't need to. I knew my mother would open it first, with the tight, skeptical fingers of someone always expecting to find a bill or a judgment. I knew Lindsay would read hers in private later, after the kids were asleep, her face flushing with a mix of admiration and envy she wouldn't know how to process. And I knew Brian, well, Brian would never mention it aloud, not to me, not to anyone, but he would hold on to that photo like a grudge, carrying it in some back drawer of his mind, a permanent reminder that his big sister, the one he never took seriously, had played a longer, harder game and won. Sitting in my car, hands wrapped around the steering wheel, I didn't feel the need to rush. The headlights cast soft beams across the lawn, catching the edge of the porch where, moments later, I saw movement. My mother, wrapped in her cardigan, her lips pursed into that hard, unreadable line she wore whenever control began to slip through her fingers, stepped outside holding the envelope like it might burn her. Her eyes searched the driveway, locking onto mine with a sharpness that was no longer maternal, if it ever had been, but something else entirely, something defensive, startled, maybe even afraid. And for a fleeting second, I wondered whether she would speak, whether this might be the moment she finally said what had gone unsaid for decades. But she didn't. She just stood there, the porch light casting a yellow halo around her that did nothing to soften her edges, and I watched her figure shrink in my rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. Driving home, I didn't think about the house I had bought or the documents I had left behind. I thought about all the Thanksgivings before this one, the years I had shown up hoping, stupidly, for a shift in tone, a glance that held more than passing judgment, a question that didn't start with "still single" or end with "but are you happy though?" I thought about the time I gave them a framed photo of my first property, ribbon cutting and all, and found it the next year in the basement, wedged between Christmas decorations and a cracked snow globe. I thought about every time I let it go, every time I swallowed the hurt, every time I chose silence because I still believed silence could earn me peace. But peace doesn't come from shrinking. It doesn't come from waiting to be invited to a table that was never built to hold your weight. Peace, I had learned, comes when you finally stop asking for a seat and start building your own damn table, brick by brick, with your name etched into the wood. Back in my apartment, quiet and warm, I poured myself a glass of wine, not to numb, not to forget, but to mark the end of something. Not the end of family. I wasn't naive enough to believe blood simply evaporates, but the end of needing their approval like oxygen. The end of thinking I had to play small to be accepted. The end of pretending that being alone meant being incomplete. Because the truth is, I am alone in the way a mountain is alone, self-contained, unmoved by weather, and quietly towering over everything they thought I would never rise above. And as for next Thanksgiving? Well, they can toast Brian all they want. But they'll never forget who made them choke on the pie.